right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to those in Europe or Asia. Welcome to the third day of the Xendee University Week, where we discuss global perspectives on distributed energy. We are starting today with a session entitled The Gulf Cooperating Council Energy Transition, Navigating Energy Security, Demand Growth, and Distributed Energy Solutions. I'm Guerrero from Xendee, and I'm the moderator of the session. This session will examine how GCC countries can balance three critical priorities on energy transition, energy security, and demand growth. We'll examine how distributed energy solutions can play a role at this pivotal moment in the energy transition. Our discussion will start with a background and getting to know more of the region, and then move towards discussing distributed energy solutions. As with previous sessions, we have a Q&A, and you could type in your questions anytime, and we'll have those answered at the last part of the session. And so I'm excited to introduce and welcome our panelists. We have Howard Bevan. He's the Secretary to the Board of Trustees and Director of Energy of the Attiyah Foundation. He's an energy economist and senior advisor with more than 2 decades of experience across the oil, gas, LNG, and power sectors in the Middle East. He previously held senior positions with Kuwait Oil Company and Qatar Energy. Now he leads energy research, policy analysis, and stakeholder engagement at the Attiyah Foundation. His expertise spans energy economics, LNG markets, energy security, risk management, power sector economics, and energy transition policy. Next, we have Michael Wood. He's a sustainability partner at Ernst & Young with over 18 years of experience advising governments, utilities, energy companies, financial institutions, and infrastructure developers in sustainability, climate resilience, decarbonization, and energy transition strategies. Prior to joining Ernst & Young, he was a partner at Deloitte Australia on sustainability and climate. His work focuses on helping organizations integrate climate and sustainability considerations into long-term business and national development planning. Next is Steve. Steve Lobo is a senior engineer at Buro Happold, specializing in power network planning, energy economics, renewable energy engineering, and low-carbon development strategies. His work focuses on design of power infrastructure for cities and reducing operational energy demand through engineering design, energy modeling, renewable integration, and smart building solutions across commercial, institutional, and urban development projects. Steve is also an adjunct lecturer with De Montfort University in Dubai, teaching graduate-level courses for the MS Energy and Sustainable Development Program. And lastly, our fourth panelist is Robin Mills. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Comar Energy and a non-resident fellow of the Columbia University on Global Energy Policy. He's one of the Middle East's leading energy strategists and economists. Through Comar Energy, he advises governments, investors, and energy companies in oil and gas markets, LNG, renewables, hydrogen, carbon management, energy security, and energy transition strategy. He is a widely published author and commentator on global energy economics and geopolitics. Yeah, thanks for having here today to discuss the GCC energy transition. And to start our discussion, we have Steve to give a presentation to give everyone a background about GCC countries.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for the introductions. I'll just get the slides on the screen. Just let me know when everyone can see it. Hopefully everyone can see that now.
Yep, we can see it now.
All right, perfect. So those of you who are not aware, the Gulf Cooperation Council comprises of 6 countries: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. As you can see on the right, why this is a conversation point today is the fact that we have the highest per capita emissions when compared against the world. This obviously comes from the fact that we are very rich in resources for fossil fuels, and a lot of our energy demand does go for cooling. So obviously higher energy consumption in the region compared to the world. Speaking a little bit about energy demand in the region, A lot of it obviously is fossil fuel based, so you can see natural gas, oil, obviously dominating the energy demand by carriers. A lot of it obviously also goes for electricity, most of it which is going to be for cooling our spaces. Obviously, it's toasty out here. The summers can be quite hot, so we do need space cooling. We are also starting to see the advent of the use of bioenergy, hydrogen, and derivatives. Self-generated electricity is not very common in the region as compared to the US or the UK, for example, but it is an area that is slowly growing. In terms of the future, obviously, as the population increases in the region with several mega events and giga projects coming online over the next decade or so, we're going to start seeing increase in energy demand, most of which is going to be, again, space cooling. What's also going to be interesting is the fact that we need potable water to support the population. So desalination, given that most of the countries in this region don't have a lot of underground water resources, desalination is obviously an energy intensive process. So that is also going to be a factor in driving energy demand across the region. Other interesting areas that are also going to contribute to that is data centers. There was a 1 gigawatt data center campus that was announced in the UAE, for example, quite recently. Electric mobility is starting to become a focus as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over the next decade, as well as the fact that we have a mandate, as you can see on the screen. There is a mandate across most, if not all, of the countries to increase the renewable energy percentages across their electricity infrastructure, most of which do have targets for 2030. For example, UAE, which is where I'm based out of, has a target to reduce emissions by 19% from the 2019 baseline and to triple their share of renewables by 2030. Also, clean energy is going to be 44% of the capacity by 2050, and they're already making very, very strong strides, obviously, with the use of the nuclear plant. Again, other countries will also be contributing to that. So, for example, players like Oman have set up a large energy transition fund. So, obviously, that's going to drive some investment within the energy infrastructure and electricity systems. It'll be interesting to see how these play out. Obviously, the targets are there, and the reason why we're here is to try and speak about this energy transition and how we can make that a reality. In terms of recent developments, obviously, there's a lot of investment coming into the region for the energy infrastructure, especially. What's interesting to see is in the UAE, for example, Abu Dhabi has expanded self-supply solar policies for the residential sector. So that means you can put rooftop PVs. Obviously, it drives home the fact that distributed energy resources are going to be an interesting means of achieving the energy transition. Similarly, in Dubai, DEVA has announced the D33 initiative, which allows industrial facilities, for example, to meet their peak demands from solar PV. Other interesting initiatives that have come out of the past 6 months is the fact that Saudi Arabia, for example, is looking at a 3 gigawatt battery energy storage facility, specifically to help grid stability and obviously they use renewables as well. And as I already mentioned, the Oman Investment Authority has announced a large investment fund to accelerate energy transition in Oman as well as the region. I think obviously we'll discuss this, but there are opportunities across the value chain. Clean energy generation is obviously a priority in the region. Transmission and distribution, though fairly recent in terms of the infrastructure that's been built out, I think what's going to be interesting over the next decade is with these large giga projects, there is going to be a pressure on utility companies to try and expand their networks as quickly as possible. And this is where the economics of clean energy, for example, obviously comes into picture. Energy storage, for example, is being implemented across all of the utility scale renewables projects. As most of you may already know, the cheapest solar and wind utility scale projects have been the cheapest in this region. And the advent of electric mobility, which is also going to drive energy demand up. So that's going to be interesting and how we tackle that as an industry. So I'll pause here. Bray, I'll hand that back to you. Thank you for giving me the chance to give everyone a download.
Thank you so much, Steve. We're going to reference some of these key points that you mentioned. Gonna
Yep.
start with Michael. For Michael, just gonna hone in. Can you elaborate on how important is net zero and climate resilience when planning future electricity systems in the Gulf?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. And look, they go hand in hand. We often see there has been a focus, heavily focused on decarbonisation in recent history, but resilience in terms of electrical and energy resilience, that's the sum of mitigation and adaptive capacity coming together and having the ability to respond to shocks. Now, I have in part a climate science background, and even under the sort of most optimistic scenarios, warming is already locked in. So even if we stop emitting today globally, because of the energy system, there's a lag in that system. We've locked ourselves in for another 20 years of warming at least. So our systems are changing, whether that be climate and energy is certainly changing. Now, what that means in a practical sense is that these challenges are happening on a day-to-day, and they're impacting the reliability, productivity, utilization, and availability of assets. And what we mean by that is extreme temperatures, there's flooding events, particularly in the GCC. I'm based in Qatar. Dust storms is a problem. The other one is I really like this example. So every 1 degree Celsius ambient temperature goes up, the ability of the atmosphere to hold water goes up 7%. So that's a scientific theory. It's a physics. It's known physics. You need a water source though to enable the atmosphere to hold that water. Unfortunately, the GCC has the Gulf, and that is the perfect water source to be able to provide that moisture to the atmosphere. So we get incredibly strong, incredibly high humidity events in the shoulder periods of the day, and that impacts reliability of equipment, performance of equipment, derating, pre-cooling, pre-treatment, all the things that you'll know as engineers if you are on the call. Now, for greenfield assets as well, we often see that what happened in the past isn't going to happen in the future. And a lot of the time we use statistical downscaling to have that connection of what happened in the past is going to be the same in the future. It's not. And so as engineers and as product developers and so forth on the call, that needs to be factored into the basis of design. What happened in the past isn't going to be the same for the future. So one interesting thing as well as I close off this question, as we introduce more electronics and we electrify things, is that going to impact the resilience of infrastructure itself, as we also need to build adaptive capacity in what we do in terms of electrical systems? So that's an interesting thing, whether what we do now is actually increasing resilience or is it decreasing resilience by electrifying everything? I think there's enough engineering now to manage that risk, but it's just I think there's always a trade-off. And to get to the point of this question is, if we just solely look at decarbonisation as the strategy, we're missing half of it. We need to think about adaptation as well.
Interesting. And speaking of adaptation, this is a question for Robin, but everyone can join in as well. Like, how do geopolitical developments and changing global energy markets actually influence the GCC's energy transition strategies?
Sure. Well, that's a very complex topic because it has a lot of long-term and short-term implications. In the long term, it's pretty clear. It increases the urgency of diversification and decarbonisation. The Gulf, as we've heard, has a long-standing strategy on decarbonisation, on getting into more renewables in particular, but also other low-carbon energy forms, boosting carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and to some extent to different countries, electric vehicles, nuclear power. So all those policies and imperatives are very much there. And they would be even in the absence of conflict. I mean, the Gulf knows that there's a climate imperative to reduce emissions. It knows that non-oil technologies and non-hydrocarbon technologies are increasingly competitive and large scale and will be a competitor to its own oil and gas exports. So it needs to decarbonize and invest in these technologies both at home and abroad. And you've seen some of the GCC's investment companies, take Masdar from the UAE or Aqua Power from Saudi Arabia, have been very successful investors in renewables and batteries in recent years all over the world, not just in the Middle East, but also in Central Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in the US, China, and elsewhere. So that imperative goes on, but it's even more urgent, I think, now because of partly the disruption to oil and gas exports out of the Gulf, and this makes other earnings very important, partly because of the recognition that the conflict and the high oil and gas prices and the perceptions of insecurity is going to mean that other countries will turn even more aggressively towards low carbon and non-oil and gas approaches. We've seen that in China already, to some extent in Europe, and we'll see it in other countries as well. So that kind of date for peak oil demand has probably been brought forward. The future trajectory for oil and gas demand doesn't look as strong as it did a year ago. So the Gulf countries know that they need to meet that challenge. But obviously in the short term, there's disruption. They have major solar power projects underway here, big logistical undertakings. They need to bring in solar panels. They need to bring in equipment. And that is now competing with a whole bunch of other equipment that now can't come in through the Gulf, that has to come by road or rail from other ports, overland, less efficient, higher cost, and with congestion and so on. And obviously there have to be priorities. I mean, bringing in essential goods, food and so on, industrial feedstock, key building materials. There's all those kind of priorities alongside the priorities of trying to keep the renewable projects moving ahead. And there's an energy security issue even for the Gulf. We've heard from the earlier speakers about the need for desalination and air conditioning in the region. Reliable power supply during the summer is essential. The oil and gas production in the region has been significantly affected and been cut back significantly because of the inability to export. So the Gulf countries also, of course, need to ensure their own domestic energy security, make sure they have enough power generation through the summer. And of course, solar is a great contender and a great contributor already in some of the Gulf countries. If you take the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Oman, it's already a significant and fast growing part of the energy mix. So, complicated story. But overall, yes, I think it's clear that this maybe there's some short-term turbulence, but this is going to boost the energy transition in the Gulf over the next few years, as it will globally.
Thanks, Robin. That's really interesting. And speaking of this disruption and also what Michael mentioned about making sure you're adaptive, this is a question for Howard. What are the biggest risks to energy security now with this transition and all these short-term events? And how can policymakers actually mitigate them, especially now with the short term?
Well, I think that there are two angles to this. For energy security, if you're talking about the GCC countries, they don't have any problem with energy security. They've got a lot of hydrocarbons. So for internal consumption, there is not really a problem. And as everybody's been saying as well, there's a growing sector of the solar power. So you've got hydrocarbons, you've got solar power. Internal security is not really a problem. Externally, what are the problems of maintaining that security? Robin's just touched on supply chain problems for solar, all sorts of bits and pieces, so there is supply chain risks, yes, for energy security. But perhaps, we hope that the Hormuz opens up again and the ships go backwards and forwards. But that's a short-term problem. Also, there's not really. We talk about economic competitiveness, and is there a security problem about stranded assets being a problem? Will we be competitive? Will there be a supply problem? Because nobody will want our product. But in truth, the Gulf, in just about every aspect of hydrocarbons that they touch on, they're the lowest cost supplier. So if you're going to get crude oil from somewhere, let us say from the US, well, if it's going to go to Asia, it's going to be cheaper to take it from Saudi Arabia. These are a fact of life. If you want gas, the cheapest gas in the world is probably from Qatar, where if you do the sums in a particular way, it's got probably a negative cost of production because of all the co-products. So I'm not really one of the problems then about competitiveness is how much is the revenue going to bring in? And that is the external problem. If everybody moves towards their own insular solutions, then of course the export revenues will go down, and that's the other side of security. It's not secure. The security problem is to do with revenues, and we've all got used here to very high salaries. Everybody else, not me, but the others, your panel there. But it's the whole. We're wealthy and we have a good lifestyle, and we have got low taxes. The security problem is to keep that going.
Mhm.
And that's where we come into one or two things like solar power and other uses will release gas, to be export. So, and that I think is really the only security problem is can we keep the markets going? And if what if Europe starts getting more wind power, that takes away our need for gas. That's the real problem. Can we keep the gravy train growing and going?
I see. That's an interesting point. So it's not really internal, but external, and having the security with
Yeah.
the revenues and the supply for these exports.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
The other point I will make is we talk about the GCC, but they're fairly distinct countries within them with their own solutions and their own problems. So it's sometimes not too easy to batch together the GCC as a sort of entity.
I see. That's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Follow up to that. With these countries, like Steve showed, they have really ambitious climate targets. So with what just Howard mentioned, I'd like to get your thoughts, Michael, on like how realistically we could, meet those targets, and how does it align with the energy security that Howard just mentioned?
Yeah. I mean, Howard, myself, and others within the region actively have conversations around this, and there's such unique characteristics in the GCC. And I echo Howard's point that each of the states within the GCC do have their nuances. They're very different in terms of the characteristics, attributes, and those types of things. So that is of a particular interest. Now, when it comes to that is also extends into the targets. Each of the states have different targets, whether they be absolute targets or intensity targets. And what's a little bit different, and what really drives capital allocation and vision and ambition here is the national visions. That is what each of the states is committed to over X, Y, Z period, and most of them are set to 2030. And there's this resetting process that happens, and that looks at everything. So those visions are incredible in terms of the way they structure up not just energy systems, agricultural systems, social systems, and so forth. But for me, when it comes to the targets, it's important that hydrocarbons will remain in this region for decades and decades to come. They will play different roles as long as there's demand. As Howard said, this is a low-cost center for hydrocarbons. There'll be a pivot to petrochemicals, absolutely, and there's utilization of those for downstream processing. And renewables are seen part of this solution set, not as a displacement solution. So renewables are here to complement hydrocarbons, not to displace. And I'll give you the example why renewables are important. Firstly, it displaces high-cost production. So as Robin and others were talking around, the production of electricity from solar is the cheapest form in the world in most locations globally. What it does with renewables, it displaces consumption domestically and enables it to be sold by export, or it enables that product to be used for value-add downstream processing. So that's the importance of renewables, it's yes, it's a decarbonisation strategy. Yes, there's targets, but also from an economic perspective, it makes a huge amount of sense to displace those hydrocarbons for export, but also for downstream value add activities. So that's the way I see it. And for anyone, I would encourage you to look at the visions. That's the point. I'm Australian. When I came to the region, I was incredibly humbled to see and encouraged to see the ambition through these national visions. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Michael. So with that, you spoke about renewables. I'm curious. This is for Robin and Steve. There are other technologies as well. So how do you assess like long-term prospects for hydrogen, carbon capture, other emerging low-carbon technologies such as small modular reactors in the Gulf region? Because that could, aside from the mature technologies that Michael mentioned about solar, there's also other long-term prospects for other technologies. So I'd like to get your thoughts, Robin and Steve, on these upcoming technologies, or probably it's already there in the region.
Sure. So, as you say, we have some deployment of these technologies already. There are already carbon capture projects in several of the Gulf countries. There's a very large conventional, not small modular nuclear reactor, but a very large conventional nuclear program in the UAE, which has been very successful. And there are hydrogen projects on a small scale, pilot scale so far. But next year we should see the startup of the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, a very large renewable-based hydrogen project. There are several large hydrogen projects in Oman, UAE, and low carbon hydrogen production in Qatar as well. So there are several big projects in this area. I'd say, look, they're all doing different things. So I don't put them in opposition or as alternatives to renewables or to oil and gas. They're doing different things. So if we take carbon capture, that's about cleaning up the industrial sector. So the operating project in the UAE, for example, is based on iron and steel production. So carbon capture will be used to clean up heavy industries, fertilizers, cement, iron and steel, as I say, petrochemicals, refining, and so on. And then hydrogen is again doing different things. Hydrogen is primarily about synthetic fuels and about industrial energy, not really for power generation. So whether it's used domestically or for export, the hydrogen will be used as an input into things like low carbon shipping fuels, aviation fuels, for iron and steel production, chemical production, and so on. It may be turned into various forms and exported, whether to Europe, Japan, South Korea, and so on. It may be used domestically or a mix. So again, that's fitting a different need. I mean, we can't fly planes around the world on batteries at the moment, and probably never will. So we have a need for synthetic fuels in that area. And then the nuclear side is an interesting one. Yeah, the small modular reactors. I think this is it's an area that the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain have all looked at and are all interested in currently. This is a question, I think, of your electricity mix. So your electricity mix in the Gulf region will be, at the moment, is predominantly gas, a growing share of renewables, mostly solar, some wind power, bigger and bigger share of batteries, and in the UAE's case, as I said, conventional nuclear power. I think the question is here: do small and modular nuclear reactors have a role in that, and if so, what? Is it balancing out the intermittent renewables, providing steady, reliable baseload? Is it powering remote sites, kind of off-grid sites with kind of micro reactors, like military bases or remote oil or minerals installations, this kind of stuff? Is it providing desalinated water? Yes, there's a range of roles that those small reactors could play. And there's a lot of interest in them, but I think we do need to see on that case some demonstrations of working reactors that come out with good economics, that are delivered on time, on budget, and get the supply chain for these reactors coming up. Quite a few examples around the world, particularly US, a lot of innovation, but also from China, some European companies and others. So we'll have to see which kind of turn out as winning designs on that. But certainly another area worth watching.
Thanks, Robin. Steve, do you wanna add?
I was gonna say, I think Robin hit the nail on that point, but just in terms of small modular reactors, because from my experience working in the States, we've looked at or at least I've looked at the economics of this quite a bit. And there are companies that are obviously more mature than others. There are also campuses in the US, like University of Illinois, that have nuclear reactors on their campus to supply power to their campus. I think what will be interesting to see is like Robin mentioned, is how these small modular reactors take away the pressures on the grid, especially for large like load centers like data centers and desalination, for example, and make those completely off grid. But these are fantastic technologies to provide base load and run 24/7. So I think where it'll become challenging is obviously the economics of it, because this is obviously a newer technology as opposed to the more established turbines, and obviously the fuel resources that we have in the region. But like Robin also already mentioned, that the UAE, for example, has been looking at the deployment and case studies for the micro reactors, for example. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that comes around, but definitely maybe a long-term thing, probably 20, 30 years out. Obviously, we have to see how the benefits play out in applications in the US, for example. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Steve, Robin. Yeah, we've seen some projects also in the US, like within that time range. So hopefully we'll see if it's gonna fit the requirements that you have in the Gulf region. And
if I might chip in here as well, and I think what we've heard is that there are lots of sort of little projects which will fit in here and not fit in there. We're looking at carbon capture. It'll fit in somewhere. There are lots of niche things. And what will happen is that somebody will appraise them, a country or a company, and say, no, that's not for me, but this one is. So we'll see lots of different little technologies coming up and being tried and tested. And just picking away, at fossil fuels and solar, which are, will predominate.
Right, that's right. And speaking of those different technologies, we've talked about these technologies. In most cases, these are, I believe, like centralized systems. So for everyone, like realistically, like how much of the future electricity demand growth can be, realistically met by distributed energy solutions rather than new centralized generation? So
who's that question for?
This is a question for everyone.
Maybe I can chip in first, actually, because we looked at the slides, right? So I think it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a mix, right? A lot of the demand for buildings, for example, is for space cooling, and historically in the region, district cooling systems have been proven to be more efficient than individual chillers, right? So that's a system that obviously needs centralization, because industrial chillers are just more efficient than the individual chiller units. And you can see over the past 2 to 3 years, for example, for renewables, at least in Dubai, industrial sites do have the opportunity to now meet all of their peak demand from distributed energy resources, which predominantly will be solar PV. And again, the announcement of Abu Dhabi's self-supply for residential means a lot of the energy demand for residential assets can be taken off, at least during the day, through solar PV. So I think some systems, yes, they do require centralization like cooling, because you can gain efficiency there, and then you can also offset some of your energy demand during the day through generating on site. So yeah, I think it's a combined mix, which we'll have to push for.
Yeah, I think I just have a couple of observations to add to that. One is, if you do big utility scale solar, of course, it's going to look cheaper than residential solar, rooftop solar. However, you can also lower the costs of rooftop solar by, firstly, with new developments, building it as an integral part instead of doing retrofits, by having major schemes where you fit a whole bunch of buildings at the same time, not one by one. And secondly, also the grid savings. So if you can diminish the peak demand and save on the grid infrastructure, you'll actually see bigger savings in that than you will just on the generation side. So certainly the distributed generation has a role there, and with more kind of distributed batteries, of course, you can improve the impact on the grid even further. and in an energy security challenge, when you're doesn't apply to the Gulf so much, and hopefully won't, even through the current conflict. But there are plenty of countries in the region where the energy security issue, where the grids are not reliable, and where distributed solar already has a big role. And I think that's I think one key point on the reliability and the value of distributed solar power that I think is very much worth looking at. And the other role is there are plenty of sites in the Gulf, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, which is a big country, where distributed solar absolutely has a role, because you have remote farms, you have remote military bases, you have industrial sites, you have mines and oil field facilities, you have mobile oil field facilities, you have drilling rigs, for example, where you can electrify them, you can get emission savings and cost savings, but you don't want to be connecting up to the grid every time they move. So again, distributed solar and hybrid systems with a diesel generator backup or now increasingly with battery backup are looking more and more attractive.
I think Robin made the real point here that when you put distributed systems in, it puts off the time when you have to build a major new power station or a major new solar farm. So it's like a sort of it's a sort of way of putting off a large investment. It's a sort of, how would I put it, inverse of demand management. You can chop things down until you have to build a new nuclear power station, this sort of thing.
I see. That's interesting. So there's economics really driving these as well. And I'm curious about two things. So one is, are there any policies I think Steve kind of touched base about this in the slides, like any policies that really accelerate adoption of these technologies and behind the meter or distributed solutions? And are there sustainable finance and ESG frameworks in accelerating investment in distributed energy technologies? So I guess I could ask Michael first about the sustainable finance and ESG frameworks, and then the rest could add in about the policies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is a very pertinent issue globally. I'll probably be very direct for everybody. I don't know if an ESG framework has ever solved a global issues as complex as climate or broader sustainability issues. So I fear where we're at in the world, broad sustainability more broadly has been limited to a disclosure issue, which it's not. It's absolutely not. This is the most complex issue facing society and the globe, that being the climate challenge. At the moment, though, it's not been seen like that. So in terms of where I'm going with this is that there is a lot of frameworks here. There is a lot of policy activation happening in the region. I would say, going back to my earlier point, though, everything is directed and channeled through the national visions. So if you want to have a really good idea of what each state is doing, is national visions. For example, Qatar National Vision is set to 2030, and it's delivered through a number of different strategies. And within that, there is things around, as we were just talking around, displacement of grid spend through the penetration of renewables. There's around 8 gigawatts of renewables being deployed in Qatar at the moment. That's their objective, and there's about 4 million. There's around 4 gigawatts installed currently, and that's expanding. So there is that. But for me, why this is important is that, and more importantly, this is a capital issue. So by providing this information to market, what you're doing here, and the GCC is very good at this. They do this for capital access, cheaper finance, and those types of things. By understanding these types of risks, you can source capital outside the region. You can attract inbound capital for these types of investments. And that's probably one of the challenges that the GCC's had to evolve a little bit around being transparent in areas that naturally just hasn't been the case in the past, and trying to open up like that. And they're doing a good job in terms of that. So, but there's recognition that the financial markets are starting to place pressure on this. And so whilst there is the disclosure side, whilst there's regulatory side, the main push is capital.
I see. That's interesting. Are those also like policy driven, or it's really just the financing sector that's pushing for it?
Yeah, there is policy. Policy's there to set the guardrails. The thing is, there's downstream policy. So the markets which the GCC provide product to, say for example Europe, there are border adjustment mechanisms like CBAM, which place a price on inbound products that don't have a carbon price. So there's pricing mechanisms within the offtake markets that affect products, and within the GCC there are policies that are shaping where capital goes and how the economy should behave. I think for me, as a broader thing, what will ultimately shape what the GCC does is who's going to pay for it. If there's no off-taker, GCC won't create it. And hydrogen is a great example. I can't remember the exact, so please critique this. I believe the market's around 80 million tons hydrogen used for mostly industrial processes. It's been fairly stable for a decade off memory. There's no large-scale green hydrogen being produced for large-scale transport or industrial processes for power generation, etc. If there is, I tell you what, the GCC will have the appetite to invest into that. But until there's no major off-takers, timing will be the issue, and there'll be a wait and see type of approach.
I see. Anything to add, Howard, Robin, or Steve?
No, it's exactly about these national vision documents. Are very comprehensive. A bit of a wish list, but gradually, because I've looked at them and been helping produce them over the years, they do focus change. These national vision documents, and each of the GCC countries, I believe, have them, are quite unique. They are a way forward.
I see.
Yeah.
Right. I'm actually also curious with the capital availability, and probably Steve would be the one that has some visibility as well. So are these capital like available to residential, commercial, or industrial market, or is there like a specific market that's more like favored for it?
I think that's an interesting question because as Bureau Happold, right, we're advising large-scale developers and master planning cities across the region. So I think it varies. So developers that are preparing large-scale master plans, for example, have more say in what they can do. For example, one of the panelists also brought up NEOM, right? And NEOM was very far away from the grid, so they decided to set up their own utility company, which was Innova. Developers, for example, obviously have the power to do that, and a lot of that financing can come from obviously development banks. Development bank in the UAE, for example, is fairly nascent, but I think these will drive investment. Obviously, a lot of the master planners and developers in the region, for example, in Saudi, are obviously supported by the public investment fund. So these are sizable funds, right? And they can help. If the mandate is set, they can help drive these investments. I think just hearing and seeing as an engineer master planning all of these developments in cities, I think what I've seen, for example, is the fact that there is the infrastructure side of it. Like some cities are very close to the grid, and in that case, a business as usual scenario is let's just connect to the grid because the grid is just connecting to the grid is cheaper. But I have seen clients push for it. They have pushed for distributed energy, despite the fact that you still have to connect to the grid, but distributed energy resources, for example, offset some of the costs that consumers will see. I think the onus on us as the region, obviously, is the fact that most consumers are not very aware on how their energy costs reflect in their pockets, for example. How it kindly alluded to it because we're obviously well paid in the region. So energy costs really are not something that we think about twice. But I think as that changes and as you start seeing savings in your pockets from offset peak demand and energy costs, and people will start to become more aware. And some utilities are already doing it, right? So, for example, in Dubai, DEWA sends me emails almost every other day saying, "Oh, your energy consumption today has probably gone higher than usual," and that's just because I'm at home, right? And sometimes I'm at the office and I save some energy there. So, not to say that obviously work from home or office arrangements change that, but yeah, I think it's a driver. Knowing consumers here need to be more aware of their energy demands and how that obviously has a downstream impact on the grid will also be interesting. But there are developers in the region that are pushing for it. So yeah, positive news there.
Yeah, that's interesting that they're not very aware until you tell them. And that's where you come in with the discussion for these distributed energy solutions. I have a lot more questions, but in interest of time, I'm going to go through the audience questions. So from Suganda, question is, when you say net zero targets, is it mandated by any regulations? Or is this just a vision and like a target?
Yes, some of these have been ratified through the Paris Agreement, so there is ratification. Others are not ratified formally, and then there is local policy regulations that are setting those things, and some of it's sectoral as well. But I'd say what is different particularly within the GCC, is the visions are pseudo legislation. So what's in there happens. It may not happen through direct regulations, but it happens through capital, it happens through cultural interventions, it happens through infrastructure interventions. So for me anyway, I think they're a lot more powerful than specific regulation or mandatory instruments.
Interesting. So it's not really just relying on these regulations to meet these targets. I see. The next question from Suganda as well. So does DEWA plan to incentivize residential solar? And will there be a possibility of giving back to grid? Or I think this means like net metering or selling to the grid.
I can maybe take that one. I think in terms of DEWA's plan, obviously that's specific to DEWA, and we are seeing some progress in terms of the D33 initiative, for example, where they're allowing industrial consumers to start planning for solar and using solar power for their own consumption. Obviously, the second half of that question means that DEWA will have to start looking at metering and how the additional solar that's coming into the grid will impact grid operations. So I very hard to answer. Obviously, DEWA will have their plans, but I think if the industrial sector is one way of looking at it, then I'm sure it's on the horizon in the near future.
I think Robin.
And of course,
Go ahead, Robert.
I was going to say that in our electricity distributors here, we do have feed-in tariffs. They're not quite economic at the moment, not catching up, but it is coming, and the metering is slowly going in. But of course, a chunk of the population, a small chunk, which is the Qatari chunk, doesn't pay for electricity. So there's an interesting aside to it. So it's aimed at the expatriate feed-in tariff market, whatever that might be.
Interesting. That's interesting. I have a few more questions, but we don't have time. I think Robin was about to say something as well about the DEWA plan to incentivize residential solar.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, obviously there are several utilities in the region, DEWA and now Oman for some years, and Abu Dhabi and Howard mentions Qatar as well, who all have these kind of usually net metering programs. I mean, they don't have, let's say, subsidies for solar as you've had in Europe for a long time. And electricity prices in the region are still pretty cheap, even for expats. So the incentive to install it on residential buildings is limited, and that's why I mentioned earlier the need to kind of build in solar from the start of a construction program. It's much harder to make it work as with retrofits, but on the industrial side, it does work. I mean, many industries see cost savings from installing solar alongside their general electricity consumption. The Dubai industrial electricity prices are high enough to make that viable. So there's been certainly a lot of uptake from industry. We had 500 megawatts of industrial rooftop solar as of 2 years ago, probably even more now.
I see. Thanks. And last question, just one last question from James. Can you talk more about the carbon capture projects, any use case, scale economics, and scalability outside the region? And I think this is addressed to Robin.
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of carbon capture projects in the region. I mentioned the Emirates Steel project in Abu Dhabi. You have the Qatar project, which captures carbon dioxide from natural gas processing from the LNG plants. You have a Saudi project, Othmania, which is a similar project. And there's a number of bigger and larger proposed projects. Saudi Arabia has a proposed 10 million ton a year hub, for example. So these at the moment are, relatively small. You're talking 1 million tons up to, I think the Qatari thing is 2.5 million tons a year, which is kind of the size which we're looking at globally. And most carbon capture projects in the world today are in that scale. And we know that's too small. I mean, we know that to make a meaningful impact, we need to be doing multiple projects at the tens of millions of tons per year scale. We need to have hubs that will have multiple projects. We'll be gathering from a whole range of industries, power plants, oil and gas industry, and so on, and capturing these kind of tens of millions of tons a year. So the Gulf region, it's certainly making a lot of progress on carbon capture. It is one of the main global regions for it. But we know that carbon capture just globally has to scale up a lot more. It needs the right incentives. If you speak costs, I mean, this region, as usual, as it is with oil and gas, as it is with renewables, it will be one of the most cost competitive regions, probably the most cost competitive for carbon capture anywhere in the world because of its advantages on the planning and regulation and the geological advantages. So no concerns there. It all goes back to the incentives. Obviously, carbon capture costs something, and in the end, somebody, whether the government or the consumer, has to be paying for lower carbon products. So that's no different here from anywhere else in the world.
Right. Thanks, Robin. Just to wrap up the session, a question for each of the panelists. In one sentence, what should the region's top energy priority to be over the next decade? So let's start with Howard. I'm just going from left to right.
Yeah, I am a bit of a transition skeptic, and I think the aim for these GCC countries should be wealth creation.
Thanks, Howard. Michael?
Yeah, I think it's just capitalize on the natural advantage that the region has. Location, infrastructure, natural assets, it's all here.
I see. Thanks. Robin?
I mean, those are all great topics, of course. I think the one I would say is on technology and innovation. So really seize the opportunity to build some world scale innovative energy businesses in these emerging energy technologies that are going to drive economic growth over the next couple of decades.
I see. Thanks. Steve?
Yeah, I think as an energy engineer practicing here, it would definitely have to be to try and learn from what's best across the world and try and bring those practices and innovations here. We've obviously alluded to the fact that microreactors, for example, could be a future technology. So yeah, it'd be cool to see how those change the energy market in this region.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thanks for the audience for sharing those questions. We have a few questions in the audience. We're gonna send an email to respond to them. And yeah, thank you so much for the rest of the participants. You need to log off of this session to join the next session. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a
Thanks
great
everyone.
day.
Thanks, Ray.